I really wanted to open up the conversation really to ask Mohammed about your sort of journey so far, because you're a psychiatrist and a philosopher, which is not in itself unusual. I think it's quite well-trodden territory in psychiatry to have an interest in philosophy. But you've kind of moved from clinical work to philosophy and back again via a very active, I think, engagement with mad politics. And I wondered if you could sort of say a little bit about that journey, because I think it's very interesting. I wondered if I could sort of pass on to you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Helen. I'm really pleased that you're here. As I was saying before, that we've connected over the years and we've done some work together. So I'm really glad to be speaking to you today. So, I mean, I won't really bore you with details of how the past 20 years of my life have gone, because I don't think I have a clear idea of how to formulate all of it in any coherent sense. But I guess just really some important points along the way. So when I started reading and thinking about philosophy, I was still in medical school. I was in fact in the final 2 years of medical school in Cairo in Egypt. I have to say Egypt because there are 16 towns called Cairo in the United States. That's what I learned. And my first job after graduation was actually in orthopedic surgery. Psychiatry was not at all in my mind at the time. But it didn't last very long. It was impossible to work the hours required of surgery while staying up late at night reading Kierkegaard. It just didn't work out. And it was around the same time that my reading of philosophy and my interest in philosophy moved on to thinking about mental health, which was for personal as well as intellectual reasons. And so before I even chose psychiatry, I was kind of really aware of the problems in aspects of mental health practice. It was then that I decided to move my medical training and to move into psychiatry, but my interest in philosophy continued. And so after I finished my core training, I decided that I want to spend most of my time doing research. And that's what I did for about 12 years. I did my PhD, I wrote my book on identity and recognition. And after finishing and publishing the book and, talks and papers which happen after you publish a book, I felt that I want to be back on the front line, so to speak, which is what I'm doing now alongside my continuing research. I guess, Helen, you also were hinting at something about how it kind of perhaps changed how I practice, or changed how I'm doing psychiatry now compared to before engaging with all this kind of research. And I must say that, before I really did engage in full-time research, I wasn't very much a believer in the idea of diagnosis as some sort of natural kind or some sort of entity, that we can get to know in a very objective sense. But now, even more than before, I really just see it as a way of communicating, of thinking about treatments, of thinking about prognosis, but it's certainly not as a final say, and sometimes even a say at all, on the meaning of the problems or the issues. So if one thing is that I'm much less bound to it in what I do than perhaps I was before. And what I also now am able to do more is to, in a way, like popularize and inform the person that I see about alternative ideas about mental health, inform them about where to read about these ideas, where to find them in books and magazines, in a way to open up the discourse around what's happening to them beyond diagnosis and beyond the medical model. Because something that I really realized, discovered along my research, is that there is a serious state of, we can call it the cultural impoverishment when it comes to mental health. There really aren't that many alternative ideas out there in a popular or a public sense. So people come in distress and they really have nothing to hold on to except those limited set of medical and psychological narratives. So what I try to do is to tell them that there are alternatives and there are other ways of looking at it.
I'm muted on. So what was your engagement with sort of mad politics? I think that has, because my understanding of your work is you've kind of tried to use philosophy to address a big issue in relation to the demand from the survivor movement or from the Mad Pride movement for social justice on the grounds of an identity of madness, which is quite a strong claim and has been quite a controversial claim. And I know that your kind of work has tried to use philosophy to investigate that claim and to see whether or not it has grounds, and if it hasn't, then why not, and do we need to change the grounds for those claims? And I wondered, where did your kind of involvement in Mad Pride and Mad Politics come from? I guess it's not a common thing for psychiatrists or indeed philosophers to get their hands dirty with the mad movement and mad activism. And I just wondered what your kind of contact with that was and why it influenced you so much, because it clearly has had quite a profound influence on your work. I wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yes. When I first began to really engage with problems in philosophy of psychiatry, as Anthony was saying earlier, one of the first problems that you come across is the whole issue of the definition of mental disorder. That really, if there's a defining topic for the field, that would be it, and the other topic probably would be phenomenology. So yes, and so as you of course are very aware, that the whole debate around mental disorder was in a way a response to the social critiques of the 60s and to the claim that psychiatry is not really able to define a legitimate domain of of our suffering that is a medical problem, as opposed to being a normal struggle of life or just difference and so on. But what I really became interested in, and what was a big part of my PhD really, was the way that culture was an actual exclusionary criterion from being considered to have mental disorder. So there was this criterion in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and accepted quite broadly that if a person presents with something that looks like a delusion and expresses something that looks like a hallucination, they should not be diagnosed as having a pathological condition if it is part of their subcultural experience and it is accepted by people in the group. And so there was this kind of idea that being part of a group protects from judgments of psychopathology. And I remember many years ago that me and some people were thinking about it at the time. We called it the safety in numbers intuition. And we saw an example of this in the well-known removal of ego-dystonic homosexuality from the Diagnostic Manual by a vote by the members of the American Psychiatric Association in 1973, a vote that was brought about by political campaigning at the time. So it is possible to get together and impose a benign interpretation of whatever features we take to be important to our lives and to our experience. And from there, I began to look into, in mental health, where else is it happening? And I immediately came across the Hearing Voices movement, which are really trying to do something similar in relation to voices. And from there, it was really just one step to engaging with Mad Pride and with other attempts to create new mental health identities. And so that's how kind of I came to engage with this kind of arguments. And then once you see these arguments being made, and once you begin to see the historical context behind them, the force behind them, the way they arose from civil rights activism in the 70s, once you begin to read the first person accounts, once you begin to understand what is really lacking in our existing language of mental health, it's impossible to then say, that's just a set of ideas. They're not. It really matters, and it's quite important to take them very seriously and to try and find ways of reconciling them with the current and existing understandings which appear to exclude alternative ideas about mental health.
So what do you think philosophy kind of offers us, and why, and what does it offer to mad activism and the struggle for social justice? Because I guess that's behind this. And I just want to sort of preface the fact that why I think your work is kind of interesting is that underlying it is a kind of philosophical kind of interrogation of the claims for social justice, in a way, grounded in a mad identity. And given that madness is such a kind of marginalized, oppressed, excluded and subjugated kind of identity, both in terms of the public and common sense, as well as policy and practice. So in the sense that, you know, people talk, legal scholars talk about madness as a kind of human rights exceptionalism. So you have your human rights until you are deemed to be mad, and then your human rights can be overtaken. So it's like it operates as a kind of exceptionalism in terms of mental health law and policy, and how sort of systemic that exclusion and oppression is. And people talk a lot about issues of epistemic injustice and marginalization, oppression, stigma, discrimination, and you name it. And many people sort of say that mad pride and mad studies is sort of the last bastion of, I don't think it's the last, but it's certainly one of the last bastions of a kind of civil rights or human rights movement. So your work is very important, I think, because it does seek to interrogate those claims, but not in a negative way, but to see whether those claims can be held up. And I think you take quite a favourable position on that, as far as you can, to argue that it can be. And I wondered, I guess as not a philosopher myself, but as more of a social science or a mad scholar, why do you think we need philosophy to do this rather than other approaches? Do you think there's something specific about philosophy that helps us with this claim for social justice and legitimacy?
Thank you, Helen. That's an excellent question. Well, philosophy in some ways, philosophy is part of the problem, right? And but I also believe that it can help us think about a solution. And the problem here, if we can define it really, it is that, as you put it, really, really beautifully, like human rights exceptionalism. So madness is excluded from many of the conceptions that societies take as valuable. So ideas about what is it to be a free person, what is it to be a person, what is a valuable and a valid sense of identity and sense of self. And philosophy is part of the problem, because philosophy has always excluded madness, right? Both on sort of epistemic and normative grounds. So, for example, by epistemic grounds, I mean philosophy excludes madness as a possible source of knowledge about self, even, or about the world. And this has been the case all through the history of philosophy, from Plato to Wittgenstein. Madness was always the end point of inquiry. It's almost like the thing where our theories have to end at that point. It is a departure from any common sense, and so it has nothing to contribute to the philosophical inquiry. But more than that, philosophy was also excluded madness on the grounds that moral and political theories, right, that are supposed to tell us how we should live and what we owe each other, in a sense, also excluded madness on the grounds that the mad person does not possess the capacities required for being a moral or political agent. And so this is what happens, the rights end, and the person diagnosed with this or that condition can receive sort of moral or virtuous treatment, but not be in a position of reciprocating it. So philosophy is part of the problem, and it has to kind of reckon with its contribution to the exclusion of madness. But philosophy can also help towards a solution, and this comes precisely from its approach and its methodology of trying to get some clarity on what are the source of the exclusion. What is it that's underlying the exclusion of madness in the sense of the ideas that make up the culture. And when you think of it this way, then you can identify a particular theory. Like take something like moral theories, for instance, are based on Kantian respect for autonomy. You'd find that madness is excluded, right, by virtue of the idea that the mad person is irrational. Take something like the theory of recognition and the importance of recognition for developing an unimpaired and coherent sense of identity. You find that madness is excluded because of difficulties and problems with forming and maintaining coherent identity over time. So even that sort of diagnosis, I think, is something that you arrive to by studying methodology, by studying way of thinking. But even more than just a diagnosis, you can also think about the solution. So one way in which identity matters is because it is part of how we orient ourselves in our lives, right? So our sense of who we are is something that gives a sense of purpose, sense of value. And there's also a sense in which we want this to continue into the future. So identity is important because it has a temporal dimension. It is not something that lasts a few seconds or a few days or a few months, right? And then you find that in conditions such as schizophrenia and bipolar, where there is radical personality change, or where the person's mood states bring very different motivational states or values, right? You find that discontinuity over time is disrupted. So then this is taken by some people to say, well, this means that schizophrenia and bipolar, during having in the middle of these conditions, you can actually form and maintain a coherent sense of identity. But now that we've identified the question of identity has to do with temporality, that has to do with the ability to maintain a project over time, such as engaging in parenthood or writing a book or doing something like this, we can begin to think about the values embedded in this. How much really is sufficient for a valuable life? How much continuity do we need? And at what point do we say that this is just not going to work? So there is a way in which philosophy just zooms in, if you like, on the issue that matters, which is, in this particular case, the importance of identity for the continuity of agency over time, and then enables us to see how we can modify those value limits in a way that might allow more experiences and more ways of life within it.
Yeah, I like that idea, because it then becomes an ethical question and an ethical political question, rather than a philosophical one. But once we might be able to use philosophy to lay bare where those claims are and the limits of those claims, then we can start to make more ethical decisions about, well, if for example, our criteria doesn't include mad people, for example, then maybe there's something wrong with the criteria that needs to be changed. And if so, what is wrong with that criteria and why is it problematic? And as you say, then we have to then think about how to, maybe we need to expand our definition of what a good life is, or what rationality is even, or logic. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of the philosophy being part of the problem, because I'm aware of Nev Jones's recent work, which I think is really helpful. And she kind of really brings to task philosophy, both analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, for as you say, really, for kind of actively excluding madness as not only as the other, the irrational, but not only as an other, but as the other, if you like, the key sort of limit criteria for almost for humanity is madness, and how philosophies of psychopathology or philosophies of psychiatry have tended to sort of reproduce problems with marginalization and exclusion, precisely because madness seems to be out with what we consider to be human. So if that's the case, then either that is correct, or we need to challenge the way in which we currently define what it means to be human, which is a very, very radical proposal, but maybe an essential one if we are really to take up ideas of social justice. But one of Nev Jones's critiques is that philosophy has tended to always talk about madness rather than sort of from the experience of madness, as you say, as experiential mad knowledge. And I wonder, how does your kind of approach avoid that problem, or does it avoid that problem? And if so, how? Because it's important, I think, to all scholars really to avoid that problem, because I think any scholarly work around madness can inadvertently, or perhaps less inadvertently, reproduce those very problems. So how does your approach, do you think, kind of bypass that, do you think?
Thank you, Helen. So yes, I have a lot of respect for Nev Jones and her work. I completely agree with her about her critique of phenomenological psychopathology, and I have been sort of having similar problems with it for many years. And I think what they do, which is problematic, but I'm hoping that the new generation are doing it differently. But the way that it's been done really throughout the 90s and throughout the previous decade or two, is to kind of use sort of the first-person accounts as almost like how to put it, like almost like curiosities or exotic kind of fragments of subjectivity, which they then take and overlay with this extremely complex and jargon-laden philosophies of continental Europe, and then come up with, oh, aha, well, that's what it means then to have a delusion, or that's what it means to be schizophrenic. And then they come and tell us, well, that's what it's like to be this, and that's what it's like to be that, using this kind of jargon-laden sort of philosophies. And I don't think that's the right way of doing this at all. It kind of really does reproduce a certain kind of the same alienation that you would think is partly part of the problem with a really reductive biological language, right? But just here, it's the alienation of a philosophical account that might satisfy the philosopher's sense of, wonder about the phenomena. But what interest or what value does it really have for the people concerned, and for society more generally, really, when you offer them these interpretations? So I'm completely on board with this problem. And the second point, which is how I kind of avoid this in my work. I think the first point is that I'm not really trying to offer any interpretation or any explanation or any account of, well, that's what hearing voices are about, or that's what a delusion really is about, or how to understand it. It is simply a matter of registering the range of diverse ideas about what mental health could mean and what it is, and finding ways of making room for these ideas within existing conceptions. So you're absolutely right that it has to be a sort of a dialectical process in a way. So if, as you put it, exactly as you put it, if our conception of identity doesn't work for certain people, then that conception needs to be looked at and potentially revised. But of course, this is not a matter of decree. Like it's a matter of working back and forth with the concept and with the challenge to it, and finding ways of reconciling them with each other. And so, yes, I'm hoping that the new kind of way of doing phenomenology will be much more attuned to these issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you've kind of done in your work, which is to kind of bypass the preoccupation of most philosophers in this area, to not all philosophers but the majority, of kind of like looking for the what you call the boundary problem around what is and isn't a mental disorder, and how it can or can't be kind of defined. And I think, to be honest, that's pretty fruitless and unhelpful exercise primarily. And I think you bypass that helpfully to look at, as you say, placing issues of recognition and identity first. But I was wondering, sort of Nev Jones's kind of solution to this, as I understand it, is really to privilege first-person accounts, and to first-person accounts particularly of those experiences that are usually seen to be out with our understandings of conventions of or norms of rationality. And as a psychiatrist, without, I assume, sort of direct lived experience, do you think that's an issue for you, or do you think that because you do bypass that issue, and you're not doing a philosophy of psychopathology, I don't think you're doing something different, then does that allow you, does that give you more permission, if you like, to be a philosopher without direct lived experience? Or is it still an issue, do you think, for you as a philosopher in this sort of fraught and highly politicized territory?
Thanks, Helen. I mean, it's always an issue, in the sense that it's always important to be aware of where one is writing from, and who one is writing to, and how will that be taken and received. So it really matters to think about questions about what a person is saying, how they're saying it, and why they are saying it. But in a sense, I kind of perceived, or I saw my role when doing this research, doing this book, as something like trying to mediate between different sets of views. And in that role, I wasn't particularly. I mean, I was trying to be, if you like, as fair as possible, as fair-handed as possible. And so in that limited sense, perhaps it didn't really matter at that point. But I can appreciate that some people might just the idea of it in itself, right? They might have a difficulty with that. But I think the way I approach it here, and here I'm looking purely on an idea as an idea, is that the starting point has to be with what is the person saying and why are they saying it. If I later on learn, and this is how I would approach it, that the race, the gender, or the ethnicity biased what they say, then that becomes highly relevant to what they are saying. But I wouldn't assume at the start that it is sort of relevant, but that could amount to some sort of prejudice, if you like. But of course, ultimately, it's for other people to decide whether they feel it, the way I treated the subject matter was fair-handed or not, and it can be for me to decide that. That being said, what I really have a problem for, which we kind of touched on when talking about phenomenological psychopathology, is that there has to be, when we come across, so put it this way, so we've come, the philosophers who've written this kind of phenomenological works, they have come across descriptions of human experience which seem very alien to them, right, and inaccessible. And so they said, we have to understand it. We have to understand it, but at what cost? What is the cost of coming up with an interpretation that makes sense to me? It is potentially contributing to stigma overall, potentially contributing to alienation and powerlessness of people whose stories these are about, right? So in this kind of example, it's very clear that there is a problem with coming up with all these interpretations of other people's experiences without involving them sufficiently in the end product. So there is a question of understanding and how do we negotiate these kind of apparently incommensurable realities or worldviews, in which it does really matter in a different way.
I think we'll hopefully get on to that a little bit more, but I know we're pushed for time, but I wanted to ask another question around just sort of following up with another issue that Nev Jones kind of raised. I'm bringing this up quite a bit because I've just been listening to some of her recent webinar on this very subject. And one of the things she talks about is what she refers to as the demographic problem of philosophy, and that it's tended to be, philosophers have tended to be white, male, sane, or diagnosed sane, and that has kind of skewed our understanding of the positionality, which I think is central. And what I wanted to ask you is that I feel like there's been some really interesting philosophers like yourself, from, I don't know if you'd refer to them as Middle Eastern kind of backgrounds in some way. For example, yourself, Abdi Sanati, Awais, Aftab. There's quite a few philosophers and I wondered whether you collectively are sort of managing to address in some way that demographic problem. And I just wondered, given Nev's critiques of philosophy, do you think that the increase in philosophers like yourself and the other people I've mentioned is something that's remarkable in some way? Do you think it's interesting and relevant? Because I feel like it kind of is in some way, in that I think you've all brought a refreshing new critique to psychiatry, using philosophy that's quite new and brings a different perspective. And I don't know if it relates to that demographic background, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, the short answer is not yet. I haven't thought about this particular issue before in the sense that you pointed out this recent change or slight change in demographic. I mean, Abdi is a good friend and I love his work. He was one of the first people really to write about epistemic injustice in mental health, and I really, I like Awais' work and I really respect it. Whether or not, we're sort of like moving things in a slightly different direction, it's impossible to tell. I think more than sort of ethnic or racial belonging, I think there's a question here of different generations which is really relevant. I mean, I'm talking philosophy psychiatry, and philosophy as a whole does indeed have a demographic problem. But I think in philosophy psychiatry, what I've noticed is that people's interests and concerns varied, with the different generations. So that the early generation in the 80s and 90s had different concerns to the ones, perhaps mine, and now the younger generation are even more, on board with a much more progressive and open-minded view of the problems. So it remains to be seen, what will happen next. But I'm definitely really pleased with how the newer and younger philosophers of psychiatry are engaging with problems and are becoming much more aware of everything we're talking about, of voice and representation, systemic injustice and recognition.
I mean, personally, I think it is something to be remarked upon. It does feel to me like a new and important development, and I do feel like that you and other scholars are bringing something quite new to this. And I don't quite know what that is. I can't quite put my finger on what that is, but it definitely feels like something important. But I just wanted to maybe time will tell where that will go, and we need to just keep an eye on that. But I think one of the, from my perspective, because I've always taken what I call a Sedgwickian approach to psychiatry and madness, following the work of Peter Sedgwick and his book Psychopolitics. And one of his and many other critiques, sort of central criticisms of a philosophical approach or critical philosophical approach to psychiatry, is what Sedgwick referred to as psychiatric nihilism, in the sense that from people like Thomas Satz and his classic book, The Myth of Mental Illness, which is still, I think, very influential, both within and out with philosophy, that it leaves us with very little to go on to demand support and rights and services. Because if we take away the idea of mental illness or mental disorder, then how can we make demands for support and services? And I wonder if your kind of approach has any thing to offer in relation to that issue, because I do think it's a really key one. And I think we hear it a lot in social media now. There's a lot of debates, and a lot of survivors and service users feel like that the kind of myth of mental illness argument that still in some ways advocated by many critical psychologists and psychiatrists actually undermines their claims for legitimacy and claims for rights. And I think that is a genuine concern that also concerns me. And I feel like that and Sedgwick's point was that whatever philosophy or politics we mount, it must include a justification that we can demand support and welfare for people who are suffering, whatever we want to call it, whatever we want to call that suffering. And I wondered, so do you think your work has anything to offer that, getting over that bypass, if you like, or getting over that sort of difficult terrain that ends up kind of going round and round in circles, like is mental illness a myth or not? For me personally, it feels like that's a not very helpful discussion. And maybe it relates back to your thing of bypassing around the definitions of mental disorder, that doesn't actually help us get to where we need to go. And do you think that's that's a similar approach to what I'm suggesting? Sorry, that's a long-winded question. I'm sorry.
That's an excellent point, really. I think you are right that there is this sort of trap that we're in. And I remember I heard Thomas Satz at a conference. I don't know if you were there in 2010 in Manchester.
I was, yeah.
When he his response was to the point that, what about people who need care and who need support, who need, and this and then he said, well, they can go out and get a job. And it came across extremely callous and unrealistic, and also not the way we should be thinking about this. And I think part of the problem is that we still have this kind of, no matter how sophisticated we get in terms of like capacity assessments and the MCA and the mental health and so on, we still think of it as you either are ill or you are not. And if you're ill, then you have benefits and things that if you get by virtue of being ill, and if you're not, then that it is. But I think we need to get out of this binary way of thinking. We need to embrace really what it might appear initially to be somewhat contradictory demands, right? So on one hand, you have people who refuse to think of the distress as an illness, right? On the other hand, people are invested in their mental health, social identities, and in what the distress means outside of these constructions of illness, right? And a third requirement is that they require and sometimes demand supports as might be typically offered to someone who would be considered ill on the old, or the old really, on the current view of being ill. So these things, these three things might seem to be incompatible, but that's exactly the sort of puzzle we need to work with. To find a way of delivering the kind of care that people might need during periods of being ill, without this necessarily meaning that you have to completely ignore and undermine how they want to understand what's happening to them, right? Away from these kind of constructions. But to put it really simply, we've managed to get a certain sense of care and compassion too bound up with certain concepts like illness and disease, and we need to somehow separate them and allow this to happen without requiring also this. So yes, I guess that's how I would think of a way out of this, what you refer to as psychiatric nihilism, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's really helpful. I'm aware we're running a little bit out of time, but I do want to get on to a kind of final issue that I think is really important. So hopefully we can at least touch on that before we open up to the Q&A. I think we've both kind of been wrestling with very similar issues, but from different kind of disciplinary backgrounds. And I remember when I came across an excellent paper of yours called In Defense of Madness, and I'd just finished editing a book on madness, politics, and madness, distress, and the politics of disabled women. And I wish I'd read that before I did the book. And I think one of the, and then reading your book, which came out around the same time as that edited collection, I realized that we'd both kind of come to a similar conclusion around some of these issues, which was how we needed to find a way to reconcile some of the difficult issues that we're grappling with. And we kind of both alighted on an idea of restorative justice. And I think we touched on this before around, how do we kind of work with competing demands? How do we work with often conflicting experiences of psychiatry, often conflicting experiences of treatment, medication, support, diagnosis, or the whole catastrophe, if you like. And I wondered if you could tell me about how you arrived there, because I have my own story about how I arrived at that conclusion. But I wondered if you could say a little bit just to round off about kind of where you are with that, and maybe how we could think about doing some more work around that, and perhaps other people who might be interested in taking forward a more restorative justice approach, and what that might mean in relation to mental health.
I think for me, the main thing that's kind of moved you toward thinking about reconciliation was thinking about what is really involved in achieving recognition, right? And there is something about recognition that requires that when you offer someone recognition, it has to be, in a sense, a genuine affirmation of their identity, a genuine affirmation of their way of life. It can't be sort of forced, and it can be, like a lie, or a sort of almost a forced lie. There has to be something. If you're talking about repairing social relations, it needs to be a freely and genuinely offered judgment of and repair of social relations. And so the only way to achieve this is through some kind of process of reconciliation. You cannot legislate against it. You can ban people from using certain words, but that's not going to create anything in the direction of solidarity or the kind of changes you want to see, really. So it then takes you to reconciliation, which is more of a process about getting somehow to accept each other, to make room for each other's mutual understandings, which, as an ideal, of course, sounds like extremely far-fetched, but like everything else, sometimes setting things in motion or starting certain processes might be the best that we can do. And in this sense, that the conclusion that I arrived to towards the end of the book is one that you've written about years before I published the book in 2017, in this excellent paper on. It was the first time I heard about the idea of truth and reconciliation in mental health, and I don't know. Perhaps we can stop before the Q&A. If you can just tell us a couple of things about this paper, because I really want people to know about it and to read it.
Thank you very much. I'll put a link to it in the chat, actually. But thank you so much for that. I think I don't know how long we've got, Anthony, but if you can post up how long we've got, but we've got plenty of, well, hopefully some time for a Q&A, and I think we've got some questions in the Q&A button. If people have put stuff in the chat that's a question, we won't be able to read all the chat at this point, so could you please put it in the Q&A section, and then we'll be able to look at it, and hopefully one of our other of us can at least try and make a response to that.
Should we consider? Did you put the link, Helen, for the paper?
Yeah, I'll just do that. Would you have a look through the questions?
Sure.
And
I'm having a look now.
Yeah, I'll just have a look, a link to the paper. Thank you.
So shall we have a look at the first question?
Yeah.
I think this is I mean, all of them are for both of us, of course. I mean, the first one is, can you say something about how we work on madness links with scholarly work in the field of disability studies? Now, Helen, I'm not putting you in the spot here, but you've written a book about this. Maybe you can help us out here. What do you think? You're still on mute.
Yeah. Do you want to go on to another question while I put that link to that paper up, and
Sure.
then we'll come back to that one. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I'm not very good at multitasking.
Sure. A question from Constantina Porcelanido. I recently came across outrage epistemology, feminist appreciation of anger as a source of knowledge. Do you agree that emotive states, anger, discomfort, depression can be knowledge tools? In that sense, can madness be a source of credible, trustworthy knowledge? That's a great question. I think the answer is yes. It is often through the emotive states, like anger, shame, and related states, that people come to experience that something is not right with their standing in society, with the way they're being represented in society, with the way that people are treating them in society. And so in that sense, it is a very important and vital source of social change. So yes, my answer is that it can be. Brooke Maddox, I'll read the question. The psychiatrist, philosopher whose work has helped me the most in the mental health work I've tried to carry out in occupied Palestine is Frantz Fanon. He factors into psychological suffering, colonial oppression, economic inequality, and issues of gender and race. What do I think about this liberation psychology approach to treating psychological distress, which sometimes takes the form of delusions, etc., in these oppressed and traumatized populations? Now, I'm familiar with the work of Frantz Fanon, but I'm not very familiar with what you mean by liberation psychology. I don't know if Helen probably knows what the term is and what it refers to, liberation psychology.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that there's some really interesting work on liberation psychology that I don't know that much about, but I think that it's probably not enough time to go into too much detail about what that can offer in relation. But I think the issue, particularly in relation to traumatized populations and stuff in relation to racism, I think is really important to consider. But I don't think we've probably got. I just need to check what time we're supposed to be finishing. Anthony, can you let us know? So I don't know if how much time we've got. If we've got more time, we can explore that a little bit more.
I think I'll answer 6 minutes.
Okay, right. We haven't got very long then.
Shall we take another question? Richard Smith.
Okay, well, I can try and answer the one on disability.
Sure. Okay, and then we'll go to Richard after that.
Yeah. I mean, mad studies, which I guess both of our work kind of, I would say, suggest fits within a mad studies tradition, and MAD studies really started within disability studies, and specifically one of its origins was in the School for Disability Studies at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. And there is a real kind of connection with disability studies, even though there is some tension around whether madness can be considered a disability or not. And that's the book that Mohammed and I referred to a while ago, a book I helped to co-edit around called Madness, Distress and the Politics of Disableism, which we tried to explore that issue about how much in common does madness have with the disability movement. And for example, can we use a social model of disability or not in relation to madness? Because the social model of disability historically rested on a primary idea of impairment, which a lot of mad activists may contest, but I know the social model of disability has evolved quite a lot since then. And I think it's a really key issue, actually. And for me, mad studies very much, and these questions very much sit within a broader disability studies kind of framing, because disability studies, after all, is about struggles for social justice for disabled people, which is exactly what mad studies is about. And both Mohammed and my work is about that. So I think it's really part and parcel of disability studies, even though I think it needs to remain distinct, or I would argue that it needs to remain distinct, having a distinct identity within a broader kind of idea of or project of disability studies. That's my view anyway.
So should we take Richard Savile-Smith's question? If psychiatry arose at the same time as Western colonialism, how far do you think that the native and the mad are ways of othering, and how far do you think that psychiatric and nosological systems, where to go? Yeah, are attempts to classify, to control? Does decolonization need to be broadened to accommodate diversity? Well, yes. I mean, in a way, you could always say that the way we conceive of a certain form of subjectivity, a certain form of life as so alien so as to be other is also a way in which we can set up for ourselves a mirror so we can see what we're not and to get to know who we are. So I mean, that's kind of the main functioning of the idea of othering. So there is something to this kind of view, and I think it's very close to Foucault's view, right? So when he talks about leprosy in the Middle Ages and madness sort of taking over that kind of role of the other. So there's something to that view. Whether they are systems, there are attempts to classify and control. It's hard to know. I mean, if there's an attempt, is it an attempt to classify, to control, or is it something that has the implication of controlling under? I mean, is it so basically? Do we think of this as an active and intentional way of managing deviance under the cover of medical concepts, or is it something that is needed in a limited sense, but has the implication in some cases of extending into areas that it shouldn't really extend to? That's kind of really the question, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of an open question. I don't think we have a very clear answer to it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that psychiatry, yes, probably did arise at the same time as Western colonialism, but I think that the control of madness predates both psychiatry and colonialism. I think that they both brought in a new way of managing madness, but I don't think that the problem, the social control of madness, was necessarily tied to either colonialism or psychiatry, although it certainly has brought its own problems, that's for sure. And I would definitely agree that decolonization needs to address neurodiversity and I mean madness within that, and disability. So I think that we need a decolonial project, that's for sure, and that decolonial project needs to have a more diverse approach to human psychological experiences. So that's certainly true, I think.
So we take the Kate Mansfield. Your book refers to a demand for recognition. Can you say something about the ways in which mad people fail to achieve recognition and what we can all do to reverse this? So one of the things really that are relevant here is how to change some of the public conversation around mental health, right? And to bring in alternative voices. That's obviously going to be very difficult, and I can appreciate that. And we can see that most anti-stigma campaigns are quite focused on this whole notion of parity of esteem, as in mental illness is like physical illness. But they're kind of trying to respond to very different sort of problems. And the problem they're trying to respond to are lack of access to treatment and the fact that people who have mental health diagnoses are more likely to have physical health conditions that are not really managed. But still, whenever there is something positive to be said about mental health in the media or in public, it is always that it's just like physical illness, so it shouldn't be stigmatized. But as probably Helen has found in her work, and as I found in my reading, it's this kind of view doesn't always work to reduce stigma, and in some cases it might actually make things a bit worse. So what we can do is to find a way of bringing up alternative narratives in public, but also in mainstream media. And I think a rare example of this was a documentary called Why Did I Go Mad, which was in 2017 on the BBC Horizon series. And it was quite surprising that it really gave very nuanced ideas about voice hearing, that there was no question, no way you would have heard about this a few years before. So we need more of this. We need more exposure, public exposure to alternative ideas about mental health. That's one way of introducing them into the conversation.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up. I think we've got permission to go a bit over time, so I'm going to pick up a few more questions in the Q&A. So one from Nika. Helen, how did you decide to speak on behalf of the MAD? I wouldn't really claim to be speaking on behalf of the MAD. I don't think. I think I see my role more as trying to open up a space in which madness can try and speak for itself, I guess. And that's sort of my role in Asylum Magazine particularly, is to create that space and sort of open up a space for diversity of different experiences. There's another question that I wanted to look at. There's lots of questions coming in. I don't think we can answer them all, but could you help me understand the boundary between MAD studies and philosophy as psychiatry, as I'm a gender and English studies scholar? So I think there is a quite a clear boundary between MAD studies and philosophy of psychiatry, but I think someone like Mohammed, I would see in both those categories. But I think MAD studies, I would suggest, primarily tries to privilege and at least take seriously MAD experiential knowledge or the collective wisdom of the MAD community. And philosophy of psychiatry doesn't really have that interest to do that. It's coming from a very different place. But of course, you can be a philosophy of psychiatry and also take MAD experience seriously, which is what Mohammed, I think, is doing. So there is a distinction, but there is, like a Venn diagram, there's an overlap there, which I think is quite important, because if it wasn't any difference, there wouldn't be any. But the real point and the purpose of MAD studies is because there was nowhere really like disability studies or feminism or gender studies that really centered the experience of MAD people and MAD culture and MAD politics. And that's kind of the purpose of MAD studies, really. And I think, as Mohammed, I think, has eloquently demonstrated in this conversation, there is a role for philosophy in that, or at least of the type of philosophy that Mohammed and various people are engaged in. So another question, jump in at any point, Mohammed, if you want to. There's another question from someone anonymous. Can you point up specific psychiatric conditions where the issues of exclusion and MAD pride come to life more vividly? Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I think there are certain conditions, if you like, or diagnoses where, you know, this issue becomes important. And I think MAD pride, I mean, a colleague of mine who I think might even be in the I think might have asked a question, Dina Porsanadu, talks about how, you know, or other people have also talked about how it's hard to have pride in experiences of severe clinical depression, for example. It might be kind of easier, if you like, to have pride around certain experiences, for example, mania, which often has euphoric elements. But I think, you know, really severe depression is quite a difficult thing to marry with mad pride, even though I think it's possible to do so. But I remember we published a couple of articles in Asylum a few years ago, which made that very point around the difficulties with some experiences of mad pride. And it's interesting that mad pride was actually set up by people with more diagnoses in relation to mania and schizophrenia than clinical depression and stuff like that. So there are, you know, it raises lots of really important issues, I think, around what we can reclaim and what we can be proud about, and what, you know, might be more difficult to seek pride in. But I think the issue of recognition that Mohammed is looking at sort of transcends all those. I think we need recognition for all you know, things that are psychiatrized, or conditions or experiences that are psychiatrized.
If I can add to this, Helen, this really important question is, I think one of the ideas that kind of formulated towards the end of the book is this idea of enriching the cultural repertoire. So it's almost like, and then I draw an analogy between alternative ideas about madness as being kind of cultural forms, adjustments, almost like, and then I draw an analogy with physical adjustments, such as ramps or wheelchair users. I think the idea here is that once you make these ideas part of the cultural repertoire, then they're there. They're a resource. People can use them. People can access them, and they might benefit people you might not initially thought to be relevant to. So it's kind of it's not. Yes, it is true that some people might be very unwell to take part in campaigning or in activism right now, and some people who might not be. But once these ideas become part of the culture, then they will have benefits for many people, including people you might not initially thought would possibly benefit from them.